Thanks to Envato Elements for sponsoring this video. For more information, check the affiliate link in the description. Pepsi unveiled a new logo and visual identity for the first time in 14 years, marking the brand's anniversary, so I decided to give a go at animating their logo and share the process with you guys. We're gonna set up the logo in Illustrator, then send it over to After Effects with Overlord for maximum efficiency. There we'll create the wavy liquid with the wave warp effect and give it some three-dimensionality. We'll add foam, animate the letters to come in one by one, add bubbles with the built-in CC particle world effect, which will isolate to the red, blue, and letter shapes by creating a special matte with the calculations effect in order to avoid pre-comps, and introduce some extra detail with turbulent displays. Finally, we'll bring all of those into a new comp where we'll animate the logo to pop out and spin, while also shooting out some outlines for extra interest. There are plenty of project files available from previous tutorials on this channel that you can grab either for free or by paying a few bucks, which is a great way to support the channel along with super thanks tips, or by joining as a member to get access to extra perks such as free project files that would otherwise have to be paid for. With all that said, let's jump right in and get started. Alright, so here we are now in Illustrator, and as you can see, I've already imported the new Pepsi logo, which I'll leave the link to in the description so you can grab that as well. And now before we do anything, let's go ahead and double click on the artboard size and then set the width and height to 2000 pixels. Then zoom out, we'll select all of them, hold down Alt and Shift as you scale it up so you can constrain it proportionally and symmetrically, maybe 1600 pixels, which you can see at the top right side, and then let go. Now we'll clean things up. So for example, this bottom layer, I know that it's just empty, so we'll delete it. Then we'll bring the blue and red shapes outside of that group and then rename them. Do red for the other. This one is the outline. And then for the letters, you can see it says compound path, which means there's a bunch of shapes all merged into one, but we need them to all be on separate layers. So with it selected, go to Object, Compound Path, and then Release, or use the Ctrl-Alt-Shift-8 shortcut. Now we do need to cut holes inside of the P letters, so select those two layers and then hit -front on the Pathfinder tab. Do the same thing for the other P. And then we'll start renaming these and reordering them. So P, P, and S, and I. Then we'll select all of them, bring them out of this group. And finally, we'll duplicate the outline. So click and drag it into this plus icon. And again, we need to release the compound path on the outline. Then we'll delete one of those circles and then scale down one of them just until it fits right inside of these two shapes. And it's actually very important to do this step here in Illustrator because we have these snapping tools available to us. And this will be our circle matte that we can isolate all of our layers to back in After Effects once we start animating. And we could send these over to After Effects one of two ways. We could either save this as an Illustrator file, import it back there, convert those to shapes, and then rename everything and reorganize everything, which takes a lot of time. Instead, what we can do is use Overlord, which is a third-party paid tool, but trust me, it's definitely worth it because it saves you so much time. You can select all of them. Make sure you check the Split Shapes to Layers option, which will bring them over to After Effects as individual layers. And then you can click Push Selection to After Effects. But before we do that, here in After Effects, we have to make sure we create a new composition. Just make sure it's 2000 by 2000 pixels, which is the same size as the artboard size in Illustrator. Frame rate of 30 is fine, 10 seconds long, and then hit OK. And depending where you want those layers to be brought into, that's the composition you want to be open in After Effects. So now we can click Push Selection to After Effects with all of them selected. Look at that. That's beautiful. Now, before we continue, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So, if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. Now, before we do anything, let me go ahead and color code these. So this is blue, okay, this one is red. And you can use the default color labeling feature here, but I have this labels plugin, which you can just select the layers and then assign a color to. This one will make it pink, bring it at the top. This one, do that. Now for the circle matte, we'll hit F4 to toggle the switches. You can also click this button down here and then set its blending mode to stencil alpha. And this way, every layer underneath that layer will be isolated to our circle. And you can see even the outline disappeared, but we can bring that over on top. And now when we move the letters, for example, you can see they all cut out. So think of it as a global matte that affects everything underneath it. Anyway, we'll hide the letters for now, as well as the outline and the red layer. Let's select the blue shape. We'll hit G to bring up the pen tool. And first of all, let's just extend these points. And in fact, we'll shut off the circle matte for now so we can see what's going on. Just make sure we cover the entire bottom part. We could even tweak the tangents here so that they flow properly, something like that. We can hit Ctrl-Shift-H to toggle the UI visibility so we can see if there's still like a sharp edge there. Now we'll move on to adding the wave warp effect, which I'll do by using the FX Console plugin from Video Copilot, which is totally free. It allows you to hit Control-Space on a layer and then search for the wave warp effect and hit Enter. And if we scrub through the timeline, we have some waves cruising along. Well, we can tweak some of the settings here. So for example, wave height, we can bring that up a little bit, but then increase the wave width so we don't have as many waves, 400 or so. Then for the wave speed, I want to set that down to 0 because I want to actually control the wave movement by animating the phase and then have it stop at a certain point. Because we can't use the wave speed for that. If we set a keyframe here and then hit U to bring up the keyframes, you can see these are hold keyframes. So if we set this to 1, you can see it's still gonna stay at 0 until we hit that keyframe and then it'll jump up to 1. So that doesn't work. We'll uncheck it and then set it back down to 0. And then we'll go back to the beginning, set a keyframe on the phase, and then let's say move over to about 3 seconds or so and increase the phase to 2 cycles. And now you can see it goes, and then it stops. But we can ease this one out, maybe right click keyframe velocity, and set this incoming velocity to maybe 50% so it smoothly comes to a stop. And let me bring up the circle matte. And what we'll do is go to the last frame. And if we toggle the effect on and off, you can see it's different from the original shape. So what we also want to do is make sure the wave height goes back to 0 at the end. Let's say maybe across 1 second here at the end, we can have it go from 25 down to 0. And maybe even ease those. And I'm thinking we could maybe change the direction here. So we'll do -90. So the waves move towards the right. Also, if you move back, set this back to full and then zoom in, you might want to set the anti-aliasing quality to high. So you smooth out those sharp edges. One more thing to point out is the wave type. So you can do some pretty interesting stuff with this effect. But we'll go back. And now moving on to the red shape, we'll make sure to first extend it so it covers the entire top side. By the way, if you have the pen tool selected, you can hold down Alt to switch to the Convert Vertex tool and then just drag this out so you can control the tangents individually. Do the same thing here. And I just want to have the shape flow so there's no sharp edge there. And now we'll select the wave warp effect, copy it, Control-C. Make sure you're on the first frame here because it really matters where your playhead is when you're pasting effects. So say we're over here and we hit Control-V. If that effect had keyframes applied, you can see the first keyframe is pasted on the playhead time and then everything follows along after that. Anyway, we'll click and drag those back, but let's give it some variation by switching the direction to 90 so it moves in the opposite direction. And there we have our base liquid animation. We just need to duplicate this a few more times now to add a few extra details. So let's select the blue layer first, go over to layer, pre-compose. You can even use the Control-Shift-C shortcut. We'll call it blue liquid, hit OK. And we'll do the same thing with the red liquid. So now we can duplicate the blue liquid and we'll call it blue background, bring it underneath and then move it up slightly. And then we'll add the fill effect, pick the color from the blue and then just darken it down a little bit, something like that. And then we'll go back to the beginning, hold Shift and click page down to move forward by 10 frames, trim the layer there and then bring it back to the beginning. So we offset it by 10 frames. And here, if we turn the circle matte back on, you can see what kind of effect that gives. It's as if we're looking at a 3D pool of water. And the cool thing about this is because we pre-compose the layer, it means that if we go inside and then let's say change the shape or the wave height or the wave width or whatever, that will update across all of the instances of this pre-comp. So that's why we didn't just duplicate this layer instead and then start making changes to this, maybe push it up here, because say we want to make a change, we would then have to do the same changes to each separate layer, which would then add up in time. So, you know, pre-compositions to the rescue. And here we'll rename this one to blue foreground. We'll select the blue background again, hit P to bring up the position, set a keyframe to 3 seconds or so. We'll bring that over there, go back to about 1.5 seconds, set a keyframe there, and then go back to the end keyframe and then hold down Shift as you click and drag it down to snap it vertically. And then just push it down just until it disappears below the blue foreground. And then we can select both of them, hit Easy Ease in, maybe do 50% on the outgoing velocity. Maybe bring it back to 110 or so, and maybe even 310 or something like that. And maybe bring it back up on the last keyframe and push it down just a little bit more after it disappears, so it goes away a bit more smoothly. Heck, we could even set the incoming velocity to 50% as well. Then we'll duplicate the blue foreground one more time, and this time we'll call it foam. Let's add the first effect, which is the simple choker, and then decrease the choke matte to, let's say, 35 or something. I mean, minus 35 until we get this outline. Then we'll add a set matte effect and set it to take the matte from itself, but then invert the matte. So now when we solo it out, it's cutting out the original shape and leaving us with just the outline. And then we'll add a fill effect to make it pure white. By the way, you can't see it, so just toggle the transparency there. And then we can add the roughen edges effect just to add some extra detail to it. So increase the border to about 13, maybe set the edge sharpness to 3, so it's nice and sharp. You could even tone down the scale if you want to, but I'll just leave it at default, which is 100. And then even set the complexity down to 1, so it's a very smooth shape. And then to give this some movement, we can alt click on the evolution stopwatch and type in time times 500 and then hit return. So not only is it gonna wave around, but also the texture on the roughen edges is gonna move around as well. And you can notice that more when the wave stops. Now let me unsolo that. And if you find that the outline is a bit thin, you could add the mini max effect, which is similar to simple choker in that it allows you to maybe set the channel to alpha and then increase the radius, which will expand the alpha channel. So now let's say maybe give it 1, and you can see the difference with and without it. And then lastly, of course, I want this to go away at the end. So let's go back up. We'll set a keyframe for the choke matte, hit U to reveal it. And let's say maybe at 215, I want this to completely vanish. So we'll set it back down to 0 and then go back a bit. Let's say maybe over here, and we'll do minus 35, was it? And then hit F9 to easy ease them. Okay, maybe push it back a little bit. Maybe even set the keyframe outgoing velocity on the first frame to 75%. Maybe even push it over here. Because of the roughen edges effect, the line kind of breaks out in multiple spots, which really does look like foam. And of course, we could select the blue background and foam, and then set the out point to their last frames by holding Alt and close square bracket. And also we could set these to blue. And here we can see what we have so far. And of course, you can tweak anything you like. For example, if you want to go back to the blue liquid pre-comp, you want to change the wave width or even the timing of the keyframes, you can easily do that. Let's say push it to 4 seconds and then go back here. You just have to make sure you extend these long enough and maybe even push the keyframes over here. And within a matter of seconds, you've got a different animation. And we'll move on to doing the same thing with the red liquid. All right, so I've gone ahead and done the same thing with the red liquid, but I'm thinking now the foam is a bit too thick, so we can disable the minimax effect on both of those layers and even crank up the border to say 14. Would you look at that? It even breaks up that area over there, which I quite like actually. Now let's take care of the letters. So select all of them, hit P to bring up the position, set a keyframe there. We'll move forward by maybe 30 frames, which is 1 second, because remember our composition is set to 30 frames per second. Set a keyframe there for all of them and then go back. And what we'll do is have these come in, one from the bottom, one from the top, one from the bottom, one from the top, and then the I letter from the bottom as well. So we'll select the P, the other P, and the I, hold down Shift, and then click the down arrow to move them down, and then select the E and S and move them up until they disappear like so. Then let's select all of them, push them in time. Let's see, maybe 110 or something. So there's some overlap on the animation. Instead of having the liquid tone down first and then have the letters come in. And of course, we want to make sure we ease the incoming keyframes, so let's say 75%. Another thing I want to do is offset these so they come in one by one. But before we do that, I want to actually add the tint effect to all of them. So let's do tint on the first letter. And I want to map the black because that's the original color that it has. So you can map that color to anything you like. So for the P, I'll do the bottom blue. Actually, let me go back. I'll do the darker blue because that's where it's going to be coming out of. And what you can do is animate the amount to tint, which essentially is the intensity of this effect or the opacity. So we could say go to the last frame, set this to 0%, then set a keyframe, and let's say move backwards by 15 frames, and we'll bring it back to 100%. Hit U, easy ease both of those. As it goes outside of the blue liquid, it starts going back to its original color. And now we can select the amount of tint effect, move your playhead to the first frame by holding Shift so you can snap it. Because again, if you copy and paste an effect, that's where the first keyframe is going to be put on. And now we can start offsetting these by 5 frames each. So let's select all of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on page down, move it over, control click to deselect the E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, move these over, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, deselect, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I forgot to say that the color doesn't get transferred over. So we just real quick go ahead and pick those colors. All right. So let's now move on to adding some bubbles. And we'll do that by using the CC Particle World effect. But first we need to create a sprite that we're going to use. So let's select the ellipse tool. You can click and hold on this rectangle tool to reveal everything else. You can even click Q to toggle between the different shapes. And then make sure you have nothing selected and then double click to create a perfect circle on a new shape layer. And we'll rename this to Bubble Sprite because we'll be using this as a sprite texture to generate a bunch of bubbles with our particle system. Control Shift C to pre-compose it, and we'll call it Bubble Sprite. And then we'll go inside and then right click here, go to Composition Settings. We'll lock the aspect ratio and set the width and height to 128. Because if we have a bunch of 2000 by 2000 pixels textures being generated all the time, it's just gonna slow down our computer so much to the point where we won't be able to work properly. So we'll just do that and then scale this down to like 5 or something until it roughly fits inside of the comp size. And then we'll go down to the contents and I actually want to delete the fill and then increase the stroke slightly. Let's round it out to 100. And then I want to give this some movement. So we'll go to add wiggle paths, twirl down the settings, but we can increase the size and then decrease the detail, but also set the points to smooth. So let's say detail 2, increase the size, maybe not that much. We want to retain the circular shape. And if you want to, you can change the wiggles per second, which is the speed, I guess, but we'll leave it back down to 2. And then there's this correlation, which I think is like how much you want this to be affected. So we can increase it to 80% if we want to tone down the intensity of the effect. All right, now we'll close that blue sprite composition. And back here in our main comp, we'll disable it because we don't need to see it. Now we'll go over to Layer, New Solid, call this Bubbles, and then add the effect CC Particle World, which is built into After Effects. First of all, let's shut off all the grids and guides. And we'll go down to Particle, change the particle type to Textured Square, and then under Texture, we'll set the layer to be the Bubble Sprite. And here we can tweak the look of those particles. So first of all, let's just set the birth and death colors to white. increase the opacity to 100%, set the opacity map to be full, and then increase the size variation to 100%. And let's say set the birth size to 0.15 and the death size to 0.1. By the way, these are roughly the values I used in the original animation, but you can play around and set whatever values you want here. Now we'll solo this for a moment and we'll go back to physics. And this time we'll set the animation to twirl, which gives us this left and right movement as if we're underwater or something like that. And we can play around with the extra to spin it, or tweak the extra angle to have it spin like that all the time. But I think 2 cycles should be more than enough. Now I want these bubbles to move upwards, so we'll set the gravity to -0.1 and then maybe even tone down the velocity so they don't move quite as fast. Let's say 0.25 or something. But now we have to go over to the producer and make sure we widen the radius X so they spawn in a larger area. We could even increase the radius Y, but then push down the position Y to, let's say, 0.6 or 7. So they spawn at the bottom. But now we have to increase the longevity, which is the lifetime of those particles, and basically push it up so that they have time to move off screen before they die out. Now, I do want to give this some resistance, maybe 0.5, so they don't go too crazy. But then we might have to push the longevity to 5 seconds or something like that. Maybe even increase the radius X so it covers more. But remember that these will only be visible inside of the blue, the red, and the letters shapes. They are going outside of the letters as well, so in this middle area. But we'll fix that a bit later. But now let's play around with the birth rate. First of all, let's go to the beginning here, and you can see that the bubbles are not yet visible, but I want these to be visible right from the start. So what we can do is give it a pre-run by offsetting the layer itself. And let's say maybe go to 6 seconds and then trim it there and then push it back over here. So we know that we have offset the layer by 6 seconds. As a result, giving the particles some time to generate so that they fill the entire shape as soon as the animation starts. Now we can also tweak the birth rate, so I don't want as many to be visible, so maybe set this down to 1 and then enable the stopwatch. Then we'll move forward by maybe 1.5 seconds or so and then set this down to 0. We could even hit U, F9 to easy ease those so that they stop emitting, and now eventually they all disappear. Just make sure you drag this over to the end. And also just move forward in time and make sure that no particles are popping out of existence. You know, you want to give them enough longevity so that they move outside of the shape before they disappear. And here at this point, you can kind of notice how the particles are being cut out by this imaginary line. And that's because the radius Y isn't high enough. So I want to increase it a little bit so that there's some more space. Instead of just being a bunch of particles, fewer particles over here and then no particles. I just want the transition from many particles to no particles to be a bit more smooth. Instead of toggling the transparency, what you can do is go over to the composition settings and set the background color to be white, which is what we're going to be seeing in the final animation, instead of having to use the transparency grid. And obviously we can't create a new white background at the bottom because it would get cut out by the circle matte. So we just use the composition background color instead as a workaround. And I want to bring the bubbles above the circle matte, so now they are visible even outside of the circle. And instead what I want to do is create a special layer that will be used as a matte to cut out the bubbles. Because instead of having the bubbles be isolated only to the red and blue liquid, I actually want it to be very specific. I want it to be isolated inside of the blue foreground liquid, the red foreground liquid, meaning you shouldn't be able to see it in the darker areas. And I also want it to only be visible inside of the letters on this middle area. So how can we do that without having to duplicate a bunch of these specific layers? Maybe then pre-compose them all together and then use that as a matte, because if we pre-compose them, again, we'd run into that issue where, say we want to make a change to the original letters or the red foam or whatever, we would have to go inside of that matte pre-comp and make the changes there as well, and that just gets out of control real quick. So we'll go ahead, create a new solid, and we'll call this Bubbles Matte. And we'll be using a very specific effect called calculations, which allows us to do some quick maths. This is a very powerful effect when it comes to compositing. You can set the second layer to be, let's say, the red foreground, and then increase its opacity, effectively compositing that second layer on top of this layer. But then we can set the blending mode to stencil alpha. That's essentially the same as, let's say, duplicate this, hit Ctrl-Shift-E to delete the effects, and then having the red foreground on top of it, pre-composing them, Ctrl-Shift-C, and inside of it, set the red foreground to stencil alpha. So we've achieved the same result here. But we're avoiding pre-comps and we're doing everything inside of one comp with one effect. But it doesn't stop there because we can duplicate the calculations effect and then set this second one to the blue foreground. But you just want to make sure you set this back to normal and then uncheck preserve transparency, which will then composite even the blue foreground on top. And now we can continue doing the same thing. So we'll duplicate it, and now we'll select the P, duplicate it again, select E, duplicate it again, P. You get the idea. And now if we solo this out for a moment, you can see what we've done is we've composited all of those layers inside of one single layer. And now we can shut it off and use that as an alpha matte for the bubbles. So you can see how powerful the calculations effect can be in cases like this. And real quick, I want to take a moment to shout out Brady from Texture Labs, which showcases how this effect works in some of his tutorials. So go give him a look. He's got lots of cool and useful tutorials on his channel. Now, I do want to make the bubbles displace a bit more because even though we have some size variation, you can still see how they're pretty uniform across the entire composition. So we'll add a turbulent displace effect and we'll set the amount to 10 and then maybe even set the anti-aliasing to high, and we'll alt click on the evolution and do time times 200 to give it some constant movement, and then we'll duplicate it, and for this one we'll set the amount up to 25 but then the size down to 15. Now let's see here, maybe we could even set this up to 20 as well. And now they are looking a lot more organic and you can't really notice the repetitiveness. And in fact, we'll create a new adjustment layer, call it displacement, and then add the turbulent displace effect on this as well. And then we'll go back to the bubbles, we'll select both of these turbulent displace effects, paste them on this one, and just make sure you set this below the circle matte so it doesn't affect the circle matte itself, because we want to keep a sharp circular shape around the liquid. But then let's set some amount keyframes, and let's say move over to 1.5 seconds, and then go over to, let's say, 4 seconds or so, and we'll set them down to 0 with some easing, and maybe do 50% on the outgoing velocity. So now there's some extra turbulent displacement even on the letters, but I'm thinking the second one is a bit too much. So let's tone it down to 15. But maybe increase the amount on the bigger sized one. You can see how cool the letters look as they're wobbling around. It also helps them quite a lot just to settle into place, because it looks like they come in and they're like kind of floating in the water a little bit. Also, I'm thinking the bubbles are a bit thin, so we can go inside of it and let's say set the stroke width to 150. Yeah, that looks a lot better. So now we can move on to the next step, which is to animate the logo as a whole, have it scale up and rotate and stuff like that, and even add some outlines popping out. So we'll copy the outline, then disable it because we don't need to see it here. Then we'll go over to composition, new composition, and we'll call it logo animation final. But this time we'll set it to 1920 by 1080, which is a full HD resolution, and then hit Ctrl V to paste the outline. Then we'll go over to the project panel and bring in the original logo animation. Now I want to select the outline and then center it vertically and horizontally, and then parent it to the logo animation. Hit S, we'll scale it down, let's say 30 or so. We'll also create a new solid, call it BG for background, put it at the bottom. And first we'll start with this, hit S, bring up the scale, we'll set a keyframe. And let's say the final position is gonna be 25% or something like that. Maybe have it settle in at about 2.5 seconds. Then we'll go over to maybe 1 second. We'll have it shoot up by 40%. And then on the first frame, we'll do 0%. So we have this sort of overshoot animation. and then we'll hit F9 on all of them and then click on the graph editor. And first of all, we'll select the middle keyframe. Now, if we click on the tangents, you can see they move individually. So I want to hit G and then Alt click on it to go back to a linear point, and then Alt click again to go back to an eased point. So now the tangents move together. And what I want to do is kind of have it overshoot something like that. But of course, I want to play around with the easing. First of all, I want to actually drag this over. So it takes a bit of time to charge and then explodes like that. And then this one also very quickly settles in. And one thing I want to point out, which is very important, is that the animation part usually takes the most amount of time because I'm trying to dial in the keyframe timing and the easing and all that. So I can't really just say, okay, do this, set a keyframe here, and then set a keyframe here, and then do the easing like that, and then you're done. You just gotta go through some trial and error until you land on something you're happy with. So I'm gonna go ahead and speed up through this process. All right, now let's hit Shift R to bring up the rotation while also keeping the scale visible. And let's say set the rotation to -180 or something like that. Set a keyframe and we'll go back to, let's say, 10 frames or so and move forward to 3 seconds and we'll set it to 0. And then hit F9, go over to the graph editor. And I want to kind of tweak it so that as it starts scaling back down, that's when the rotation starts to happen. But then I want it to very quickly go back to its original position. So it's as if the movement kind of makes the letters pop out of itself. So you can see here, and then the letters pop out. But you can see what I mean. It's just a matter of dialing in the timing and the easing. And here I'm thinking the scale is just happening a bit too soon. Yeah, look at that, boy. That makes me happy. That makes me happy. Now I want to go ahead and add some secondary motion. So we'll create a new null object and we'll call this pop scale. Hit S, let's go, let's say frame 20, set a keyframe there, and then we'll parent the logo animation to it so we can see what's happening. We'll move forward by 5 frames, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on page down, and then we'll increase the scale to 115. And let's say move forward to 210, and we'll bring it back down to 100%, and then we'll ease those. And I want this to be very sharp. It just jumps out immediately. And then have this kind of match the easing of the original circle animation scaling down. So I actually want to move these over a little bit. And I actually want it to scale up even more. All right, so it goes. And then we'll do another null object. And we'll call this constant scale, parent the pop scale to it, hit S, set a keyframe, and we'll go from say 1 second where it kind of slowly starts to scale down, and we'll go all the way over to 5 seconds and set the scale to 90%, or let's say leave it at 100, but we'll set this one to 110. And then we'll hit F9, go over to the graph editor, drag the easing on that, so it doesn't just come to a stop abruptly, it kind of goes. And that's why I'm using a bunch of these null objects so I can get very smooth secondary motion. All right, now one last detail we want to add is a couple of these outline that burst out of the circle. So without anything selected on the ellipse tool, make sure you hold down Shift and then double click to get this perfect circle, even if you don't have a square comp size. And we'll call this blue ring. I want to delete the fill. Keep the stroke, we'll set the color to the blue and then increase the stroke width to like 100 or something. Then we'll duplicate the stroke and for this one we'll set it to black, but then increase it a little bit more so we can see that black outline, let's say 150. And then we'll hit S to bring up the scale. We'll set a keyframe, move forward by a second and we'll scale it all the way up so it disappears. But we want to make sure we parent this to the logo animation so that it moves with it. And we want to bring this all the way at the beginning. Now let's say round up the scale to 500% and then we'll ease it and also drag this all the way. Just make sure it disappears onto the edges and then we'll search for stroke width, set a keyframe for those, hit U to reveal all of the keyframes. We'll move back a bit so we can see the outline. We'll bring these at the beginning, but then as they move forward in time, I want these to become thicker. So let's say 200 and 250, and then push these over here, hit F9, go to the graph editor, we'll drag them all the way. And now we can duplicate this, go into the stroke, and we'll copy the red color, and we'll just offset this to occur right as the pop scale kicks in. So boop, right here. Oh, and you can see how it's not going far enough. So let's just say push it to 600. And in fact, make sure you're on the last keyframe. We'll delete them. And let's even say set this to 250 and this one to 300. So the red circle is a bit thicker. Also, this might be a minor thing, but you can see how on the very first frame, as the red outline pops out, which reminds me of renaming it and even color coding it, it is intersecting with the logo itself. So we could say trim one frame at the beginning, but then the animation is kind of jumpy. It doesn't register as well. So I want to keep that down. But what we can do is just add the CC radial scale wipe effect, which is a circular transition from the middle. Here, I'll solo this out and just increase it until we have this sort of white outline around the logo. We'll set a keyframe at the beginning, move forward by one frame, and then set it back down to 0 so it doesn't affect it anymore. And in fact, I want to actually bring this over here, do that, move forward 0%. And that way it never intersects with the logo. Oh, and we do need to trim these as soon as they disappear so they don't reappear later on. And here we'll set the end point with N at 5 seconds and then hit 0 to RAM preview the final animation. And we have... Okay, it's taking a bit longer to render out. All right, looking good, looking fresh. Alright guys, so we finally reached the end of the tutorial, so thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. You can also grab other stuff that might come in handy, at the same time supporting the channel that way. If you're feeling generous, you could also leave a tip with the super thanks button, or join as a member with a monthly donation and get access to extra perks such as free project files that would otherwise have to be paid for. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.